Before we begin, I need to extend an invitation to you. If you enjoy mind-bending stories that leave you wondering and keep you thinking long after they're over, then subscribe to the channel now, because what you're about to hear today is something you won't easily forget. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I like to imagine how far these stories go. The biting wind that blew across the St. Lawrence River seemed to carry an ancient lament, as if each gust brought with it echoes of something interrupted, unfinished. The unfinished structure of Boldt Castle stood like a monument to what never came to an end. Cold stone walls, windows as empty as hollow eyes, and towers that seemed to point to an indifferent sky. In 1900, that isolated island was not just a grand architectural project. It was a symbol of devotion, or at least that's what George Boldt believed. George was a man known for his rigid discipline and meticulous vision. Everything in his life followed an almost obsessive order: schedules, contracts, projects. His hotel empire was not the result of chance, but of relentless dedication. However, there was something that escaped his control. Louise Boldt was not just his wife. She was his only unpredictable variable. Unlike him, she possessed an unsettling lightness, a presence unbound by rules. Her smile appeared unexpectedly, her attention wandered easily, and there was always something in her eyes, a kind of silent distance, as if part of her was never truly there. It was because of her that George decided to build the castle. The work began with military precision. Workers arrived before dawn, tools echoed across the island, and each stone was placed with purpose. The project was ambitious: 6 stories, ornate towers, gardens planned with perfect symmetry. A palace erected in the middle of nowhere, isolated from everything, as if George wanted to create a world where nothing could interfere. But isolation comes at a price. The workers began to notice subtle changes. Tools would disappear and reappear in unlikely places. Doors that had been locked would open the next morning, and occasionally someone would swear they heard footsteps on the upper floors, areas still under construction where no one should be. George was oblivious to everything. To him, it was just a distraction, human error, inattention. Louise, however, was not unaware. She would spend hours walking through the unfinished structure, her fingers sliding along the cold walls as if trying to feel something beyond the stone. Often, she was found standing before windows without glass, gazing at the river with an expression no one could decipher. One afternoon, one of the workers reported seeing her talking to herself in the main hall. But it didn't seem like a normal conversation. She paused. She listened. She responded with a slight nod of her head, as if someone were standing before her. When questioned, Louise simply smiled. "This place isn't empty," she said, almost in a whisper. The phrase spread among the workers as a warning. In the following days, the atmosphere changed. The silence grew heavier. The sound of the tools seemed muffled, as if the structure itself absorbed the noise. Some men began refusing to work after sunset. Others simply didn't return. George reacted firmly. He replaced the workers, increased supervision, and prohibited any kind of unproductive conversation. But there was something he couldn't control. Louise was changing. Their walks grew longer, her gaze more distant. At night, George would wake up and find her absent. On more than one occasion, he had to search for her in the dark corridors of the castle, finding her in unlikely places, at the top of an unfinished tower, in the middle of an unlit corridor, or standing before a wall as if waiting for something. "You need to rest," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. She just watched him. "Can't you hear me?" George never answered that question, because deep down, he was beginning to listen. First, it was something almost imperceptible, a distant sound, like light footsteps. Then came the echo of something I couldn't identify. It wasn't wind, nor wood, nor stone. It was rhythm, like someone walking, but out of time. On that particular night, the castle was especially quiet. There were no workers, no tools, no wind, only the distant sound of the river. George woke up abruptly. The room was empty. Louise had disappeared again. He stood up, irritated but also restless. He grabbed a lamp and went out into the corridors. The flickering light revealed shadows that seemed to move beyond the reach of the flame. Then he listened. Steps, not in front, not behind, above. George looked up at the ceiling, as if he could see through the structure. The sound was slow, irregular, and there was something else, a second presence. This time, he didn't hesitate. He climbed the stairs quickly, each step echoing louder than it should have. The air seemed colder as he went closer. When he reached the last accessible level, he found Louise. She was standing with her back to me in front of an open window. But she wasn't alone. George couldn't explain what he saw at that moment. There was no defined form. There was no clear shape. But there was movement. Something around her. Something that didn't belong there. Or perhaps it belonged there more than anywhere else. "Louise," he called. She didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his face was different. There was no fear. There was understanding. "Now you see too," she said. The lamp in George's hands flickered violently, and then, for a brief moment, the sound ceased. Absolute silence, as if something had decided to wait. The castle is no longer just a building. He began to behave as if he were present. It wasn't something you could see directly, but you could sense it. In the way the air seemed denser in the corridors, in the way sounds traveled unevenly, or simply in the growing discomfort that made even the most experienced men avoid staying there for too long. The island, once seen as an isolated refuge, began to reveal a more hostile character. The St. Lawrence River no longer seemed merely a geographical boundary, but a silent barrier, as if separating that place from any common logic. The few workers who remained began to develop rigid routines. They avoided certain areas, especially the upper levels. They didn't talk about what they saw, but they shared glances, quick, knowing, laden with something that didn't need to be said. Among them was Thomas Hale, the foreman. Thomas was a pragmatic man, shaped by years of hard work and unpredictable situations. He wasn't easily impressed. He had already seen accidents, deaths, and all kinds of human behavior in extreme conditions. Still, there was something about that place that he couldn't rationalize. He was the first to notice patterns. The tools didn't disappear randomly. They always reappeared at specific points in the castle, as if someone were organizing something invisible. The doors didn't open by chance. There was always a sequence, an implicit path, as if something were being followed repeatedly. And there were the sounds. They weren't constant, but when they did appear, they followed an almost deliberate rhythm. Footsteps that didn't belong to anyone present, light scratches like fingers on stone, and sometimes something that resembled breathing. Thomas tried to convey this to George. The conversation was short. "You need to consider that there's something wrong with this place," he said firmly, avoiding any hint of superstition. George didn't look up from his papers. "The problem lies in distracted men and poorly supervised work." "It's not that." George then stared at him. "So what is it?" Thomas hesitated for a moment, not out of fear, but because there weren't enough words to describe it without sounding absurd. "I don't know," he finally replied. "But it's here." George didn't like vague answers. That same day, Thomas received stricter orders. Keep the men focused, avoid unnecessary conversations, and ensure that the work continued on schedule. But not everything could be controlled. Louise, increasingly detached from ordinary reality, began to interfere directly in her environment. She began to change small details, moved objects, doors left open, altered pathways within the structure itself. It wasn't chaotic. There was intention. One morning, Thomas found a string of lit candles in an unfinished hallway. There wasn't enough wind to keep them burning. There was no one around. At the end of the corridor, Louise was sitting on the stone floor. "You shouldn't be here," he said, keeping his distance. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the empty space ahead. "They don't like it when we interrupt," he murmured. Thomas felt an immediate discomfort. "Who?" She finally looked at him. "You already know." The answer wasn't what bothered him most. The fact was that deep down he was really starting to know. Meanwhile, George became increasingly isolated in his obsession. The reports ceased to make sense. The schedule was being followed, but there were inexplicable flaws, minor delays, misplaced materials, constant rework, as if the castle itself resisted completion. Still, he insisted. If there was one thing George Boldt couldn't accept, it was the idea of failure. But his obsession began to reveal something deeper. He wasn't just building a castle for Louise. I was trying to trap her there. Not in a physical way, but emotionally. Each stone, each tower, each detail was an attempt to create a space from which she could not escape, neither to the outside world, nor to that which was calling to her. But Louise no longer fully belonged to that world. Nighttime has become the most critical period. It was when she was walking, without a lamp, without hesitation. Her footsteps echoed through the corridors as if she knew the way, even in the unfinished areas. On more than one occasion, she was seen climbing to levels that did not yet have safe access, and there was always someone watching. Not directly, but enough to be felt. Thomas began to lose men. No deaths, not officially, but disappearances. One worker simply didn't return after the day was over. Another was found on the island's shore, confused, unable to explain how he had gotten there. A third swore that something had followed him to the boat and refused to go back. George treated it all as job abandonment. Louise treated it as a consequence. "They don't understand," she said once as she walked beside him. "This place wasn't made for us." George stopped. "It was made for you." She smiled, but there was sadness in that gesture. That's exactly why. That same night, Thomas decided to stay at the castle after sunset. He needed to understand. He chose a strategic spot near the great hall. He extinguished his lamp and waited. Silence settled in slowly, like a presence settling in, and then it began. The steps, clearer this time. They weren't far away. They were close, very close. Thomas kept his breathing under control, his eyes fixed on the darkness. The sound wasn't coming from a single point. It was moving. It was going around, as if something were circulating. Then, for the first time, he saw, not a complete form, but an outline. Something slightly distorted the space around it, as if the air were being compressed. There was no face, no body, only the unmistakable sensation of presence, and at the heart of it all, Louise, standing, motionless, as if he were waiting, or as expected. Thomas didn't move, he didn't speak, and yet he was certain that he had been noticed. The sound stopped, silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It was heavier, more aware. The following morning, the castle appeared intact, stones in place, tools aligned, men at work. But there was a clear difference. Nobody spoke. The silence was no longer just discomfort, it was survival. Thomas Hale walked among the workers with a more attentive gaze than ever before. He was no longer just looking for flaws in the construction, but for signs, patterns, anything that would confirm what he had seen the night before. And he found it. Brands. On the still rough stone floor of the main hall, there were thin, parallel grooves, as if something had been dragged repeatedly. They weren't deep enough to indicate weight, but they were too consistent to be ignored. "Who worked here after everyone left?" he asked. No one answered. Not because they didn't know, but because nobody wanted to take responsibility. Thomas knelt down and ran his fingers over the marks. They were cold. Colder than the surrounding area. That wasn't recent. That was a recurring problem. Meanwhile, George Boldt was facing another kind of conflict, a quieter, more dangerous one. The numbers didn't add up. Materials disappeared without explanation. Costs increased without clear reason. And yet, the work progressed. as if something were correcting the deviations before they became visible flaws. It was impossible. And yet, it was happening. George began to personally review every detail. He spent hours analyzing blueprints, walking through corridors, checking structures. His need for control grew in direct proportion to his inability to understand what was before him. But what troubled him most was not the work itself. Era Louise. She no longer hid her behavior. She walked freely through dangerous areas, ignored directions, and at times seemed completely oblivious to the presence of other people. On a cloudy afternoon, George found her again on the upper level. This time, she wasn't just standing still. I was touching the wall. His fingers moved across the stone with an almost ritualistic slowness. "What are you doing?" he asked, trying to maintain control. "Learning," she replied without looking at him. "Learning what?" She finally turned her face away. "Hearing what you can't yet understand." George felt something break inside him. It wasn't fear, it was frustration. There is nothing here but stone, wood, and human error. Louise tilted her head slightly. "Then why do you keep coming back here at night?" The silence that followed was more revealing than any answer. George did not deny it, because it was true. Without admitting it, he found himself drawn back to those corridors after nightfall, always with a justification, inspection, review, organization. But deep down, there was something more, something he couldn't control. And that infuriated him. Meanwhile, Thomas decided to act. He gathered 2 trusted men and took them to the upper level at dusk. He didn't fully explain what he expected to find, but made it clear that they needed to observe and not interfere. The wait was long. The sun slowly disappeared, and the castle plunged into that peculiar darkness, not total, but enough to distort shapes and confuse distances. Then came the first sound. One step, then another one. And one more. But they didn't come from a single direction. There were multiples, out of sync. As if multiple presences occupied the same space, one of the men instinctively recoiled. "This isn't right." Thomas raised his hand, signaling silence, and then she appeared. Louise. Walking slowly down the hallway without any hesitation, but there was something different. Their movements were synchronized. Not with their own steps, but with the sounds around, as if he were following something invisible. She stopped in the center of space, and then, for the first time, something changed shape. The air around her distorted more noticeably. It was no longer just a sensation, it was visible, like subtle waves traversing space, bending light in a way that was almost imperceptible, but enough to be perceived. One of the men couldn't take it anymore. He turned around and ran. The sound of his footsteps echoed abruptly, and then ceased. Abruptly. Thomas felt his blood run cold. "He shouldn't have done that," she murmured. Louise turned her face towards them, slowly. "They don't like interruptions." Her voice wasn't loud, but she was carrying something that didn't belong to her. The second man began to retreat. "Let's get out of here." But Thomas stayed, because now he understood. That was more than just a presence. It was a territory, and they were inside it. Suddenly the sound returned, stronger, closer, and this time targeted. It was no longer in service, it was getting closer. Thomas didn't quite see what it was, but I felt it. Increasing pressure in the air, a change in temperature, and something deeper, an intention. Louise took a step back, not out of fear, but like someone who gives up space. "It's already late," she said. And then, for the first time, Thomas realized something that would change everything. It wasn't confined to the castle. The castle was being built around that. Before he could react, something passed by him. It didn't ring. But he crossed over, and at that moment, he saw. Not with the eyes, but with something deeper. Fragments, movements, repeated appearances, cycles, as if that place wasn't already occupied, but reviving something. trapped in an endless loop. Thomas fell to his knees, trying to catch his breath. When she looked up, Louise was still there, observing. "Now you understand," she said. But what terrified him most was not what he had seen. It was a certainty that this was only the beginning. The island is no longer just a backdrop. It started to function as a system. Every movement, every decision, every presence seemed to trigger something bigger, like invisible gears that silently adjusted to human behavior. Nothing happened in isolation. Everything generated a response, and not always immediately. After his experience at the higher level, Thomas Hale was no longer the same. He continued to lead the men, maintaining the routine of the work, but now his eyes carried a constant vigilance. It was no longer about organizing the work. It was about observing what shouldn't be there. He began to map the castle in a different way, not because of the architectural plans, but because of the events. She mentally marked the places where the sounds were most frequent, where the disappearances happened, where Louise usually stopped. Over time, a pattern emerged, not geometric but functional. Certain spaces seemed active, others almost neutral, and there was a central point, the main hall. It was no coincidence that it was the first space to have been structured and the most affected. Meanwhile, another subplot was developing among the remaining workers. Fear has ceased to be an individual issue and has become a collective one. They began exchanging information in secret, away from Thomas and, above all, away from any possibility of George hearing. Small accounts emerged, someone who heard their own name being called in an empty hallway, another who swore they saw a figure standing in the reflection of a metallic surface but which disappeared when they turned around. These accounts were not discussed openly. They were shared in whispers, as if speaking loudly could attract attention. Among these men was Elias Mercer, a young worker who had recently arrived. Unlike the others, he did not yet carry the weight of experience on the site, only curiosity, and curiosity in that environment was a risk. Elias started following Louise, not in an obvious way, but enough to observe her patterns. He noticed that she never got lost, never hesitated, always seemed to know exactly where to go, even in the most confusing parts of the structure. One night, he decided to go further. He waited until she began her nightly journey and followed her to an area that was not yet officially open, a narrow, partially constructed corridor. Something different was happening there. Louise stopped in front of an unfinished wall, and then it touched the surface, but not like someone who only feels. She pressed down, and he waited. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the atmosphere changed. Elias couldn't explain exactly what he felt, but his body reacted before his mind. A sudden chill, a tension in his muscles, as if he were about to be watched or discovered. And then he listened. An answer. It wasn't coming from the wall, not even from the hallway. It came from all sides, a low, uneven sound, but coordinated, like multiple voices trying to align themselves. Elias retreated. But as he took his first step, something caught his attention. On the ground, where before there was only rough stone, now there were markings. They weren't furrows, they were shapes. Lines that didn't make sense at first glance, but that seemed organized as symbols. He blinked, and for a moment he had the impression that those marks were being completed. Alone, startled, he stumbled as he retreated. The sound echoed. Louise slowly turned her face away. Their eyes met, and for the first time there was something different there. It wasn't just the distance. It was a warning. "You shouldn't have come," she said, with an unsettling calm. Elias tried to answer, but his voice failed him. "I just wanted to understand." She took a step closer, then start by leaving. But it was too late. The sound had changed. He was no longer scattered. It was targeted. Elias felt the ground vibrate slightly beneath his feet. It wasn't a physical tremor, it was something more subtle, as if the space itself were reacting to his presence. He ran. This time, there was no doubt. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, disordered and desperate. And behind him, something was accompanying it, not with steps, but with rhythm, as if his every move was being replicated. When he finally reached a more open area, he collapsed to the ground, panting. Thomas found him minutes later. "What happened?" Elias took a while to answer. When he did, his voice was low, almost unrecognizable. "He knows." Thomas frowned. "Who?" Elijah looked directly at him. "The castle." Meanwhile, George was grappling with his own internal subplot. His obsession had gone beyond the bounds of logic. He started working nights, alone, no witnesses. I walked through the corridors with blueprints in my hands, trying to understand why certain areas weren't behaving as they should. Measurements that changed, alignments that didn't hold, structures that seemed to adjust themselves. But what disturbed him most was the constant feeling of repetition, as if he had already walked those same paths before, not physically, but somehow inevitable. One of those nights he arrived at the main hall. He stopped in the center, and for the first time he stood still, not analyzing, not in control, just a present. And then he listened. No steps, no scratches, but something clearer, a sequence. As patterns are being executed, he looked around, and for a brief moment he had the impression that the space was not empty, that there was movement, that there was continuity, and at the center of it all, Louise, standing there watching him. "You can feel it now," she said. George did not respond, because for the first time, he wasn't sure if that was something he could control. The change did not happen gradually. She simply started. That morning, the castle looked different at first glance. There was no obvious structural alteration. The walls were in place, the towers remained unfinished, the corridors retained their irregular geometry. Yet something had changed profoundly. The space no longer responded in the same way. Thomas was the first to realize. As he crossed the main hall, he noticed that the echo of his footsteps was off. It wasn't just a matter of acoustics. The sound returned with a delay, as if it had traveled a greater distance than the space actually allowed. He stopped. He stamped his foot on the ground. The sound came later, and not exactly from the same point. Thomas slowly raised his eyes. "No," he murmured, almost without realizing it. It was no longer just a presence, it was a distortion. Meanwhile, the workers began to disperse spontaneously. No one waited for orders. No one tried to justify themselves. It was instinct. Elias was one of the first to drop his tools. "I'm not staying here anymore," he said, without looking at anyone. This time Thomas didn't stop him, because he wasn't sure whether he should continue either. But George Boldt thought differently. For him, that was the decisive moment, not abandonment, but in conclusion. If something was wrong, then it needed to be fixed, closed, subdued. His logic allowed for no other alternative. That afternoon, he gathered the few remaining men and gave a clear order. "The work will not be interrupted." No one answered, but nobody argued either. It was easier to obey than to remain there thinking. Louise, however, no longer participated in that dynamic. She had stopped reacting to the outside world. Now, it was the castle that was reacting to her. His behavior changed permanently. She no longer walked aimlessly. Now there was direction, rhythm, and more than that, intention. That night, everything came together. Thomas felt it before he saw it. The air changed density. The silence ceased to be passive and became expectant. He knew something was going to happen, and for the first time, he didn't try to stop it. He just followed. He followed the sounds. I followed the feeling. Louise followed. She was in the main hall, right in the center. But the space around her was no longer the same. The shadows did not behave naturally. The architectural lines seemed slightly displaced, as if the environment itself were being reconfigured. And then it began. There was no warning. There was no transition. The ground vibrated. The walls emitted a low, deep sound, like a structure being pushed beyond its limits, but without breaking. And in the midst of all this, the brands. Those lines that had appeared before were now complete. They formed a pattern, a drawing, something that had not been built by human hands. Thomas took a step back. That's not possible. Louise slowly raised her arms, not in a dramatic gesture, but like someone who accepts something inevitable. "It's ready now," she said. George arrived at that moment. The lamp in his hand trembled, but it did not fall. His eyes scanned the space, trying to understand. "What did you do?" Her voice came out lower than expected. Louise did not respond immediately, because at that moment, she was not alone. The air around her condensed, unlike before. Now there was a form, not defined, but present, multiple, overlapping, as if multiple existences occupied the same space at the same time. George stepped forward. "This ends now," but his voice no longer had authority, because control had already been lost. "It was never about breaking up," Louise replied. Then came the revelation, not in words, but in perception. The castle wasn't being built for Louise. No dust, George. Not even by men. They were just following, replying, recreating something that had already happened before. Often, in cycles. The structure wasn't a start, it was a repetition. Louise. Louise was not a victim. She was part of the process. It always has been. Thomas felt it as a physical impact. "How many times?" he tried to say, but the sentence died before he could finish. Louise looked at him, and for the first time there was something that resembled compassion. "Enough for you to be here now." George stepped forward, not out of courage, but through negation. "This isn't real." And it was at that moment that everything changed irreversibly. Space collapsed, not physically, more perceptively. The walls seemed to stretch out. The floor lost its bearings. The sound ceased to follow any logic. And then George Widow. Not the castle, but versions of him, unfinished, collapsed, abandoned, and in each of them, Louise, always present, always in the center, always connected to that. He fell to his knees. The lamp went out, and in the absolute darkness, something was finally revealed, not as a form, but for sure. It wasn't trapped there. That was the reason the place existed, and they were never in control. When the light returned, weak, unstable, everything was silent. The pattern on the floor had disappeared. The distortions have ceased. Eloise, he wasn't there anymore. George remained motionless. Thomas too, because they both knew nothing was over. In truth, it had finally begun. The silence that fell over the castle after Louise's disappearance was no relief. It was absence, a dense, almost palpable absence, as if something essential had been removed, not just from her, but from the place itself. The following morning, the few remaining workers waited for no instructions. They left. There were no goodbyes, no formal explanations. Tools were left behind, doors were left open, materials were scattered. The work, which had previously proceeded at a rigid pace, was abandoned in a matter of hours. Thomas Hale observed everything without interfering. He didn't try to convince anyone to stay, because for the first time he too saw no reason to stay. But still, he didn't leave. There was something that kept him there, not out of loyalty to George, not even out of responsibility for the work, but out of a need to understand what had not yet been fully revealed. Meanwhile, George Boldt reacted in the opposite way. He did not despair, he didn't scream, he did not attempt to organize immediate searches. His reaction was even more unsettling. He continued. That same morning, he walked through the castle as if nothing had happened. He inspected structures, analyzed walls, checked measurements. His posture was rigid, almost mechanical, but there was a clear difference. He avoided the main hall. Whenever it approached, it changed direction, as if he knew without admitting it. By the third day, the island was practically empty. Only George and Thomas remained. Two men with completely different motivations, trapped in the same place for reasons neither could fully explain. Thomas decided to confront him. "The work is finished," he said bluntly. George didn't answer immediately. He continued staring at a wall, as if searching for something specific. "Nothing is over," he finally replied. Thomas stepped forward. She disappeared. Silence. "The men have left." Another silence. "And you're still here, measuring stones." George then turned around. His eyes looked different. There was no longer just control there. There was something deeper, something fragmented. "Do you think this has anything to do with her?" he asked. Thomas did not hesitate. "I know it does." George shook his head slightly. "No." Her voice was low but firm. "She didn't cause this." Thomas felt the tension growing. "So what caused it?" George approached. "Us." The answer brought no relief. It brought weight, because deep down, Thomas already suspected it. But hearing that made everything more concrete, more irreversible. That night, Thomas made a decision. He would return to the main hall, alone, not for observation, but just to test it. If it was still there, then he needed to react. He took a lamp and a piece of charcoal. Upon reaching the center of the hall, he stopped exactly where the pattern had appeared the previous night. The floor was clean, no brand, no trace, but the air still carried something. Thomas knelt down, and he began to draw. Simple lines, trying to recreate what I remembered. At first, nothing happened. But as it progressed, something changed, not on the ground, but all around. The sound is back, weak, distant, as if he were being called back. Thomas stopped. He slowly raised his gaze. "I know you're here," he said firmly. Silence answered, but it wasn't empty. He was attentive. He started drawing again, faster now, more confident, and then the coal broke in his hand. No pressure, for no apparent reason. Thomas froze. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything seemed suspended. Then came the answer, not in shape, but in reaction. The lamp flickered violently, the flames stretched out abnormally, casting shadows that did not correspond to the surrounding structure. Thomas didn't move, because now he understood. That didn't need to be fully revealed. All it took was a reaction. Meanwhile, George was doing something even more dangerous. He returned to the spot where he had last seen Louise. Not the salon, but the higher level. The place where everything began to unfold for him. He walked to the open window. The river was calm, unchanged, as if nothing had happened. But George no longer saw the world in the same way. He closed his eyes, and, for the first time, he didn't try to control it. He just heard. The sound came slowly, not external, but internal. Memories, fragments, feelings that weren't exactly her own. And then he realized something crucial. Louise had not been taken. She had been integrated. Whatever inhabited the castle did not destroy it. It absorbed her as part of a process that needed to continue. George opened his eyes, and, for the first time since the beginning of it all, he made a decision that didn't involve control, but acceptance. In the main hall, Thomas was still standing. The lamp stabilized. Silence returned. But before leaving, he looked at the ground one more time, and he was certain of something. The lines he had drawn, they were no longer exactly where he remembered them. They hadn't disappeared, but they weren't the same either, as if they had been adjusted. When she left the hall, she found George in the hallway. The two stared at each other. No explanation was needed, because they both knew. The castle had not been abandoned. I was just waiting. Staying on the island is no longer a given. It became a choice, and every choice in that place came at a price. In the days that followed, the castle remained in a strange state of stillness. There were no more intense manifestations, nor obvious distortions as before. Yet the feeling of presence had not disappeared. She was just watching. Thomas Hale changed his way of acting. Whereas before he reacted to what happened, now he anticipated it. He began to walk through the castle every day, always at the same time, following specific routes. It wasn't a regular inspection, it was continuous mapping, an attempt to understand how the environment responded to repetition. He realized something fundamental. The castle was learning. Certain sounds ceased to occur after being ignored. Others only appeared when he changed his path. The active areas were not fixed. They shifted, as if following behavior. Then Thomas did something he had never done before. He stopped resisting. Instead of avoiding the most intense spots, he began to deliberately cross them. He walked slowly, kept his breathing steady, and didn't react to stimuli. When he heard footsteps, he didn't look. When he felt the air change, he didn't back down. Initially, the environment responded with greater intensity, sounds that are closer, more drastic changes, but little by little, that started to decrease. Not because it disappeared, but it's necessary to adjust. Thomas did not overcome what was there, but it ceased to be an unpredictable element within it. Meanwhile, George Boldt was undergoing a different kind of transformation. The obsession that once drove him began to dissolve. Not out of weakness, but through understanding. He finally accepted that the castle was not a project under his control. It was an ongoing process, and he was part of it. This acceptance did not come in words. It came in shares. George stopped reviewing blueprints. He stopped correcting imperfections. He stopped trying to finish the project. Instead, he began to observe patterns. He spent hours in silence, sitting in different spots around the castle, mentally registering subtle changes, variations in sound, light, and temperature. He no longer sought immediate answers. I was looking for consistency, and he found it. The castle did not react to fear, he reacted to interference. The more someone tried to impose control, the more intense the response became. The more someone accepted it, the more stable the environment became. But this stability was not security, it was integration, and George began to understand what that meant. One night, he made a definitive decision. He rose to the top level, alone, without a lamp. No rush. Each step was firm, but not challenging. When he reached the spot where he had last seen Louise, he stopped. The space seemed ordinary, but he knew it wasn't. "I understand now," she said softly. There was no immediate response, but he continued, "I tried to build something to keep her here, Sat, but I never realized she was already being called." Silence remained, but there was something different, closer. Pay closer attention. George took another step. If this needs to continue, then I won't stop it anymore. At that moment, the environment reacted, not with violence, but with presence. The air became denser, as if something was approaching or emerging. George did not back down. For the first time since the beginning, he wasn't trying to control what would come next. I just accepted it. And then he felt it. Not a touch, but an overlap. As if something were passing through it, not crossing it, but occupying the same space for a brief moment. Fragments emerged, not complete visions, but sensations, repetitive movements, structures being started, abandoned, restarted, and in all of them, Louise, always present, always in the center, but never the same. George opened his eyes, and he understood something that would completely change his position in all of that. She wasn't just part of the process, she was the point of continuity, and it was replaceable. That realization didn't destroy him, it transformed, because contrary to what he believed, its importance did not lie in controlling the outcome, but in allowing the process to continue. The following morning, Thomas met George in the main hall, standing, property, right in the center where the pattern had previously appeared. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked. George did not respond immediately. Then slowly he knelt down, and he placed his hand on the ground, not for measuring, not for analysis, but to feel. "Finishing what I started," he said. Thomas watched in silence, because now he understood too, but in a different way. "This isn't over," he replied. George looked up, and for the first time there was no resistance, just acceptance. "I know." At that moment, something subtle happened. There was no sound, there was no visible distortion, but space answered, as if acknowledging the change. "How do I finally—" If both had ceased to be obstacles, and it became a part. The castle no longer reacted as before. There were no more explosions of distortion, no abrupt manifestations. Instead, everything seemed to follow a silent and inevitable flow, like an ancient mechanism that had finally been understood by those who remained within it. But this apparent stability was not peace, it was alignment, and the alignment required completion. Thomas realized this first. As he continued his daily commute, he noticed that the hotspots had stopped moving. For the first time since the beginning, the pattern remained fixed, and all roads led to the same place, the main hall. It didn't matter where he started, corridors, stairs, upper levels, he always ended up being guided back to the center. Not by physical force, but by a sequence of events that inevitably led him there. Doors closing behind him, noises that made him change direction, minor adjustments to the environment that eliminated alternatives. The castle was leading, and Thomas decided not to resist. Meanwhile, George had already stopped circulating. He spent almost all his time in the main hall, not immovable, but present. His movements were minimal, precise. He observed the space like someone expecting something specific, not with anxiety but with certainty. The subplots that previously spread throughout the castle began to resolve themselves naturally. Elias Mercer, who had fled days earlier, did not return. But his absence left no void, because in a way he had already fulfilled his role. Recognizing that the castle was not just a place, it was a functional entity. The workers who left the project are no longer relevant to the process, not because they were insignificant, but because they were never an essential part of what was happening. Only those who had been chosen remained, or those who chose to stay. Thomas and George, two men, two different forms of adaptation, and a single converging destiny. On the third night after the move, the atmosphere began to intensify again, but in a controlled manner, targeted. The sounds returned, this time more organized. Clear sequences of steps, rhythms that repeated with precision. There was no more randomness. It was as if something was being executed exactly as it should. Thomas entered the hall shortly after nightfall. George was already there, not center. "It's happening," Thomas said. George nodded slightly. "It always has been." But now they both knew that it had come to an end, or at least to the necessary extent. The ground began to react, not with tremors, but with emergence. The lines have returned, slowly, as if emerging from the stone itself. They were not drawn, they were not formed, they were being revealed. The same pattern as before, but more complete, more clearly defined. Thomas approached, observing every detail. "This is a map," he murmured. George did not respond, because he already knew. It wasn't a map of a place, it was a process map, and each point represented a cycle. Brands began to expand, not physically beyond the hall, but in terms of complexity. Interconnections emerged, paths crossed, forming something that could no longer be understood solely visually. It was structural, functional. And then something else happened. The shadows began to move again, but this time not in a chaotic way. They were positional, as if they occupied specific places within the pattern. Thomas felt the air change. "They're coming back," George corrected calmly. "They never left." The sound got louder, steps, multiple, synchronized. The place seemed more crowded than it should have been, but there were no bodies, just presence. And at the center of it all, an emptiness, a space that had not yet been filled. Thomas noticed first, something is missing. George looked directly at the center of the pattern. No, someone is missing. The silence that followed was heavier than any previous demonstration. Because they both knew, the process was not incomplete due to a failure, but due to absence, and that absence had a name. Louise. At that moment, the atmosphere reacted more intensely. Compressed air, the unstable light, the closest sounds, not as a threat, but as an emergency. Thomas took a step back. What if she doesn't come back? George remained motionless, so the cycle doesn't close. And what happens? George took a few seconds to respond. When he spoke, his voice was lower than ever. He continues. That was the real pressure. No destruction, but repetition, infinity, no conclusion. And then, for the first time since his disappearance, something has changed at the heart of the pattern. It doesn't form, not a body, but presence, a different density, as if something were trying to manifest itself. Thomas held his breath. George didn't move, because they both understood. The climax would not be a confrontation. It would be a decision, and the castle. I was ready to receive her. The main hall is no longer just a space. It became a point of convergence. Everything that had been scattered, sounds, patterns, presences, was now concentrated there, compressed into an intensity that surpassed any previous experience. The air was heavy. Not just because of the density, but because of the feeling that something was about to be defined. Thomas remained on the edge of the pattern. This time he didn't advance. He understood his position. It wasn't the center. It never was. George, on the other hand, was exactly where he needed to be. No core. The point that had not yet been filled in, the lines on the floor pulsed subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a system awaiting final activation. And then, she's back, not like before, not walking down the hallways, but emerging, first as a distortion, then as a presence, and finally as a form. Louise was there, not center, but not completely. Her body seemed unstable, as if it existed in more than one state at the same time. Its contours were not fixed. At certain moments they seemed to dissolve and recompose, as if space itself were participating in its existence. Thomas felt the instinct to retreat, but he didn't, because now he understood. That wasn't a threat. That was the conclusion. George stepped forward. For the first time there was something beyond acceptance in his gaze. There was a choice. Louise, he said. The voice came out firm, but it no longer carried the need for control. She watched him. And for a moment something familiar emerged on his face, not complete emotion, but only a fragment, recognition. You took your time, she said. There was no accusation, just an observation. George took a deep breath. I was trying to stop it. She tilted her head slightly. And now? He looked around, for the standard, for the positioned shadows, to a space that was no longer just physical. Now I understand. The environment reacted immediately. The lines on the ground intensified. The sounds aligned, and for the first time everything fell into perfect sync. Louise took a step forward, and space responded. Those around adjusted themselves, as if recognizing the movement. This needs to end, said George. She stared at him. No. The sound that followed was not external, it was internal in both cases, an understanding that didn't come from words, but overlapping. George saw the fragments again, the cycles, the repeated constructions, but this time something was different. In all the previous ones, he wasn't there, not in the center, not as a choice, but as a function. Louise always occupied the central spot, always connected, always integrated. But the process never came to a close, because something was missing. Now he understood what it was. "It's not about you," George said clearly. She didn't answer, but the environment reacted. It never was. He took another step. Now it was up to standard. The lines beneath her feet adjusted instantly. Thomas held his breath, because that had never happened before. George raised his hand, not for playing, but to align. "I tried to build something to keep you here," he said, "but it was never about keeping you." Louise was watching. Property. But pay attention. It was about continuing. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a decision. And then came the twist. George didn't try to bring Louise back. He did the opposite. He took her place. He took the final step. It fell completely into the center of the pattern, at the exact point where everything converged. And at that moment, the atmosphere reacted completely. The lines closed. The connections were completed. The surrounding figures lined up in perfect order. Louise stepped back, not by force, but because I didn't need to be there anymore. For the first time, its shape stabilized. It became complete, human, book. She looked at George, and this time there was real emotion. "You understood?" He didn't answer, because it wasn't completely there anymore. The process had begun. His body remained visible for a few seconds, but its presence began to dissolve, not as disappearance, but as integration, as if it were being redistributed through space. Thomas instinctively took a step forward. "George!" But it stopped, because I knew there was nothing to be done, and there shouldn't be. The sound stopped. The lines disappeared. The shadows dissipated. And the hall returned to its original state, empty, silent property, except for two things, Thomas and Louise. She was standing, breathing, alone, for the first time. Thomas watched her cautiously. "He finished?" She took a while to reply. He looked around. He sensed the space, and then he said, "No." Thomas frowned. "So what happened?" She stared at him, and his answer was simple but definitive. He continues. "The wind blew through the open windows again. The sound of the river filled the space. And the castle, it remained, but not like before. Now, finally, working." The days that followed did not bring immediate answers. They brought silence, a silence unlike the one that had previously filled the castle, no longer laden with impending tension nor with scattered presences. It was a stable, almost organized silence, as if each part of that space had finally found its place. But that didn't mean peace. It meant continuity. Thomas Hale remained on the island for a few more days, not out of obligation, but for confirmation purposes. He traversed all the levels of the castle again, from the main hall to the unfinished towers. No visible distortion, no unexpected sounds, no direct manifestations. Still, there was something, a constant feeling that the environment was watching, not reacting, but operating, like a mechanism that no longer needed to test its limits. Thomas stopped in the main hall for the last time. The floor was clean, no brand, no trace of the pattern that had appeared and disappeared so many times, but he knew that didn't mean absence, just invisibility. Louise stayed, but not like before. Her presence in the castle no longer altered the atmosphere. She no longer walked at night, disappeared or spoke to the void. Now she was part of the world again, but there was a subtle difference, something Thomas noticed in the first few days. She never stood in the center of the room. Never. I always went around that point, as if respecting something that was still there, or someone. One morning, Thomas found her near the castle entrance. The river was calm. A light mist covered part of the island. "You're leaving," she said without asking. Thomas nodded. "I've stayed too long already." She stared at the horizon for a few seconds. "You understand enough." He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "I understand that this is not over." She looked at him. "And it never will." Thomas took a deep breath. "And you?" There was a pause. "I've already done my part." The answer brought no relief, but it brought clarity. That afternoon, Thomas left the island, without looking back, not out of fear, but because he knew that what needed to be seen had already been seen. The castle was left behind, unfinished, but it works. Louise stayed for a while longer. Days, maybe weeks. There was no urgency to leave. She walked through the corridors now with a different posture, no longer guided but conscious. She observed details she had previously ignored, touched surfaces without expecting a response. But he avoided the city center, always, until the day he decided to leave. Without warning, no goodbye. The island became empty again, completely, and that's when the outside world began to react. Official reports documented the abandonment of the construction project. Boldt Castle was classified as a discontinued project following the unexpected death of Louise Boldt. George Boldt was never seen on the island again, and over time the story was simplified, turned into a tragedy, romanticized as a gesture of love interrupted by death. But that version wasn't complete. Years later, occasional visitors began to arrive. Tourists, curious, explorers. Most people saw only ruins, unfinished structure, an abandoned castle in the middle of the river. But some people noticed. Reports began to emerge, nothing explicit, nothing that could be proven, but consistent enough to attract attention. Strange sensations in certain areas, subtle changes in acoustics, the impression that certain paths always led to the same place, and occasionally the feeling of not being alone. None of these accounts received much attention. They were discarded, explained, ignored, as always happens. But the pattern remained, because the castle no longer needed to reveal itself. It was already complete, not in structure, but in function. And at the center of it all, where before there were lines, marks, and a visible presence, now there was only space, empty, silent, property, but never unemployed. Because the process was not finished, it had simply gone unnoticed, and it continued. No rush, flawless, endless. Decades have passed. The castle remained, partially restored, visited by many, photographed, admired, but never fully understood. Among the visitors, there are always some who linger longer in the main hall. Not by chance. They don't know how to explain the reason, but they stay. I'm observing, listen, and for a brief moment, they notice a slight misalignment in the sound of their own footsteps, an echo that returns differently, out of time, almost like an answer. Most people ignore it, go ahead. But some, they stop right in the center, without knowing why, and then they feel it. No presence, not fear, but something more subtle, as if they had occupied a place that had already been reserved. And in that silent moment, something, on some invisible level, it adjusts again. Now tell me, if you were in that room, right in the center, would you stay, or would you leave before understanding what's really going on? Stories like this don't end when they come to a close. They continue in the mind of the listener, in the details that seem small but don't quite fit together. If this story captivated you, made you imagine, or even made you uncomfortable, then it served its purpose. Share it with someone who enjoys mysteries. Save it to listen to again, and observe. Each time you revisit this story, something new may emerge. And are you sure you understood everything?